Hello and welcome to the first of the part 2 video lessons. Part 2 is obviously very different to part 1. First, it's worth fewer marks and tends to be focused on particular events or key questions as opposed to the narrative or the story. So these videos will basically roughly follow the chronology, stopping at the key essay question they could possibly ask at each part, and all we will be discussing is not so much what happens, again like the standard disclaimer, this we do not focus on specific facts here, but the different arguments one could make and the different factors, and more importantly how you explain these factors. Even more so than the source question, the essay question is not about your ability to recall specific facts. You will get up to a B for that skill. Once you've maxed out that skill, you can't get any higher than a B. It is about your ability and depth of explanation about how factor X caused result Y. So in this case, how factor X, the changing economic situation, socioeconomic situation, led to Lloyd George winning the coupon election. As well as this, the exceptions to this, the balances, the links, and more importantly, break down the question. I use that phrase quite a lot. Breaking down the question is showing the examiner that you understand the world is far more complex than people did this, or people did that, or this caused this. You might say northerners, southerners, working class, middle class, that this is true for middle classes, not so true for working classes. This is true for northerners, not true for southerners. This is true in the early years, not so true in the later years. So by breaking it down, rather than simply giving a sweeping generalization about a group, area, people's role, effect, etc., you are breaking it down. And that's a really quick and easy way to just distinguish in sort of nuanced analytical arguments, and therefore get the A and A star, because that's the sort of stuff they look out for. An answer which breaks down the question, which I'll be using a phrase you're going to get sick of hearing, is one therefore you should be looking to do. So the first question we're looking at is in 1918, and in reality this is in theory a question they could ask, but I'm not massively convinced it will be a priority of theirs. And this is essentially, why did Lloyd George win the coupon election? So if we have a look at our familiar diagram, in the coupon election is where the arrow is, and it's the first major rise in the Labour Party, who more than double, and it's a major start of the major contraction of the Liberals. Okay, and what we really want to care about in this question is, what are the forces which make this happen? This is obviously a fundamental change in British politics, and this will touch in part along a later and probably more common question, which is why the Liberals decline. So I'm not going to be dwelling on those arguments so much, because you're going to have me talk about those in depth in a future lesson. So, but we are still going to look at the broad arguments one could use. Bear in mind as well, whenever we do this, it's up to you to group the factors together into paragraphs. Sometimes, if it's difficult, I'll give a hint, but usually it should be fairly obvious. I might give 10 or 11 factors, or 7 or 8 factors. You're not going to do 7 or 8 paragraphs. You might choose to ignore some. You might choose to bundle some which are very similar together. So, a couple of things that you should recall about the elections running in around 1918. Now, first past the post naturally harms those parties which split the vote. If you remember, we've talked about this a lot. If it is whoever gets the biggest share of the vote in that constituency, even if we have 60 or 70% of people who are supporting our left wing, if it's 25% each for each Liberals, Asquith, Liberals, Lloyd George, and Labour Party, and then the Tories have 30, the Tories will win. So it will look like a right-wing seat, even though it's got a vast majority of left-wingers. Likewise, although as a result of the various acts there has been some redistricting, and that means removing certain constituencies which were massively underrepresentative of the population, for example the rotten boroughs which only had a few people who could vote for an MP. In reality, cities, for political reasons, were underrepresented. It wasn't like we have today, or where we roughly have the same amount of population per seat. Instead, the old constituency boundaries made back when Britain was a far more rural country and far less urban country still largely exist. And what that means is you might have moved half your population from the countryside to a local city, but the MPs and the constituencies are basically the same. So that means essentially you've half the number of people who vote for the rural MP, and you've double the number of people who still only have one MP to vote for. And naturally, rural areas tend to be more conservative, partly for cultural reasons, partly because the spread of socialism is harder, and therefore they can't spread the ideas, and therefore the working classes and peasantry in the rural areas tend to be a little bit more conservative, as well as that the bonds of patriarchy, well, the bonds of patriarchy do exist, but bonds of patronage and paternalism, which keep the rural areas connected and are also used largely by Tory landowners, tend to keep people voting the right ways as well. And remember that because there's not massively a huge media operation, there are newspapers, radio is in its infancy, but no TV. The way you win elections is not so much about just sending a message into the ether and people being persuaded or not. It's about getting your machinery to work, machine politics. You need to get your people on the street corners talking, you need to get your leaflets in people's hands, you need to get speakers in every town hall. That requires organisation, money, and a consistent policy message. If you don't have a consistent message and what you stand for, it's very difficult to do all those things. So what is the condition of each party? Now each party has the advantages and disadvantages. In reality, on the surface, the Conservatives go into 1918 thinking they're doomed. And that's a really important thing to understand what happens in the first half of this century. Many historians are baffled, well, claim being baffled, about why the Tories spend so long as a happy sort of second partner in the coalition. So, for example, as you should know from your lessons, this will very quickly turn into a coalition where the Tories are a massive party, but they have a Liberals leader. And essentially, one of the big things we should work on with the Tories is actually, in their minds, they are a doomed party at this point. We'll talk about why in a second. But they go into this thinking they're doomed, whereas Labour and Liberal, well, Labour Party at least, is a little bit more optimistic, but Liberals have their own reasons to be concerned. So no one's massively excited about this election. Labour is, but again, they haven't had nearly enough time to get organised for a war yet. So anyway, sorry, for election yet. So the Conservatives. Now, what's having Bonar Law in charge and then having a major war which everyone agrees to has massively helped improve the unity of the Conservative Party. Okay, Law has played a very good game. If you mention, for example, the Irish, he's basically focused on issues such as the Irish question, focused on issues such as empire, which we don't really touch on in this course, focused on issues of the Britain's patriotic contribution to the war, and that has helped solidify the unity of the Tory party. There are still divisions, but everyone's more prepared to forget them, and more importantly, they are all supportive of Law, who is waving the Tory flag and making them all very happy. As well as this, because, as we mentioned, the districting is biased towards rural areas and therefore Tories, and the Tories have much more money than everyone else because of their relatively elitist background at this point. Therefore, this means if you think about elections are about organisation, turning out a vote, policies of press coverage, most press are controlled by very rich people, they have a natural favour in this regard. Offsetting that is almost the legacy of what has happened since 1903. There is still a danger of splits, okay, about the tariffs. And in reality, Law, although he's not he's a very good consensus leader, he's not a strong, charismatic public leader. He doesn't inspire confidence in people. And even his own backbenchers see him more as a functionary than a leader, someone who helps get stuff organised and helps, is a very nice chap in the private members clubs, but not necessarily someone you would jump over the top of a trench for. Okay, so in reality, the issue of tariffs could desperately split the party, and it is a real concern to avoid. And the problem is, you go into an election not having a governmental position on, a position on tariffs. That leaves you open to attacks from the Liberals and Labour Party who are thinking a little bit mischievous. The first thing you would do in an election, if you know one party is divided over an issue, is bring up the issue to encourage them to divide. As well as that, one of the biggest things which destroys the confidence of the Conservatives is they are self-consciously a part of the elite and the middle classes. But the 1918 Representation of the People Act, although it's enfranchised many women, they are still an unknown quantity. And so 1918, for them, is seen by many as the death knell of their situation, or their economic situation, or their political situation, i.e., they're a party of elite who have just about managed to get win half the elections or so, when they've got a middle class support. And now there is a feeling that by enfranchising millions of poor people, they have lost the chance to vote for her, because these people will not vote for them. And women, they again believe, won't necessarily vote for them. And they see working class female suffrage as probably inevitable down the road. So in reality, they think they are no longer a party of democracy. They don't think they can really exist anymore, and this will really help explain why they were happy to be behind the scenes puppet masters with a more populist Lloyd George as leader. And so therefore many people use a phrase, very vague and woody phrase, the Tory party loses its confidence. But in reality, that's what it's referring to, essentially, this idea that the electoral situation does look bleak for the average Tory at this point. So the Liberals. Now, obviously their advantages is David Lloyd George comes out of the war the most popular man in the country. He's also a political force. He's one of the most skilled leaders. If you look at all the leaders, remember Ramsay MacDonald is gone at this point. He will be back, but he's not in power anymore. No party has a significantly effective leader apart from, outside of David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George understands politics, plays politics, understands populism, understands how to play it, and therefore their massive advantage is the fact that David Lloyd George is their hero. Okay, and he can come out of this saying he's someone who has won the war, and as well as that, people will believe him when he pushes the idea of reform, because before the war he was the face of moderate social reform. So he comes out very quickly towards the end of the war, starts talking about homes fit for heroes and a new Britain and a modern Britain, a Britain with far more welfare state, and there's no reason people will not believe him, even if he does ally with the Tories in the end, because he has made his reputation as a man who gets stuff done, because he made his reputation as a man who fought vested interest to get popular reform. He can be believed. Now, that's the good things, and I think the fact that we've only really mentioned David Lloyd George is also a sign of the bad things. It is split, i.e., it is not disagreeing split like all the other parties, and it's sort of a perpetual issue for the Liberals. It is two physically different parties, both claiming the word liberal, but they usually have a sort of an adjective before the word liberal, coalition liberal, etc., etc. Was that an adjective? Who knows? But anyway, it's fundamentally split, and this is a death knell in British politics. I.e., this is something which is absolutely destructive in the first past the post system, and particularly when under threat of a party of the Labour Party, which is more unified and more politically effective. The Liberals look like an absolute disaster. The Liberals look like a party one cannot trust, and therefore, what ends up happening is there tends to be, in reality, a massive degree of cynicism from the public towards the Liberals. And this isn't helped by the fact that the Liberals by 1918 are ideologically tired. What that means is, outside David Lloyd George's random pronouncements, as a party they don't really have new ideas. They don't have something new. They don't have something they can build on. They don't have an exciting idea which people haven't heard before. They have the vague new liberal precepts and ideas, but people have been hearing of them for the last 15 years. But also, to some extent, they've achieved most of them, and because of the natural conservatism of Asquith, they aren't going to push any more. And so you've got two parties. You've got one under Asquith, who arguably is the more truly liberal because they believe in principles and things, but at the same time, who believes that part of the reason that Liberals were in this mess in the first place is because of new liberalism and manifested in David Lloyd George. We tend to see them talk about general liberal principles, but almost sounding more Gladstonian than they used to. Okay. On the other side, you've got David Lloyd George's Liberals, who are given all sorts of names, Coalition, National, etc., etc., who again are essentially a David Lloyd George show. People who only agree with David Lloyd George, so tend not to have ideas of their own. They just tend to sort of follow David Lloyd George's ideologically feckless policies and just agree with that. So in reality, The party does not have new ideas, does not have a reason for people to vote for it, and is fundamentally split, presenting a deep electoral challenge. And as well as this, because, if you remember, David Lloyd George comes up as a result of the war, but arguably the Liberal Party, particularly the Liberal Party under Asquith, who was so unceremoniously kicked out of office, does not necessarily come off well, i.e. people do not necessarily think of the Liberals as a good party of government. So essentially, if you look at voting for David Lloyd George's party, well, yes, those Liberals, then you could argue there is a ground. He is a very popular man, he's a very astute politician, etc., etc., etc. But also, he has a party which arguably has at least a vague idea, even if it's not ideologically coherent. The Liberals under Asquith, however, have a leader who is not massively popular as a result of his conduct in the early war, already is not massively dynamic, is retreating into more Gladstonian ideas in order to differentiate himself from David Lloyd George, which is not necessarily politically popular, and providing no ideological arguments or ideas at all. The only thing it's got going for it is there is perhaps a sense of duty amongst the more conservative and right of the Liberal Party, who will necessarily vote for Asquith in opposition to David Lloyd George, i.e. the party's become about personality. If you have resented the shift to the left of the Liberal Party since 1906, you vote for Asquith as your saviour. If you have believed in the shift in the party, you ignore Asquith and you go to David Lloyd George. So, in reality, Liberals go into election probably in the worst states, because although they have a deeply effective leader, he is only going to be useful for half the party. And even then, even though David Lloyd George has the advantage in having a good party, his vote will still be split with Liberals, and therefore there's only so many people who'll be able to get in. As well as this, the Labour Party, to some extent, present a huge threat because they will naturally eat into the standard left-wing based working class, upper working class, idealistic middle class base, who the Liberals had relied on for elections from time immemorial, i.e. those natural voters who had kept the Liberals contestable in most elections are now going to be going to the Labour Party, who are more organised and perhaps more ideologically close to what those people actually believe, and therefore deprive the Liberal Party of a significant base of support. Now, the Labour Party. Now, obviously, what is a Conservative's gain is Labour advantage, so loss is Labour's advantage. The Representation of the People Act, 1918, is the idea that, obviously, they are the party that will naturally benefit, although not as much because it's balanced by the women's vote, to some extent, from the massive enfranchisement of working class voters. You can argue as well, because of the growth of union power, thus membership, thus money, and the fact that, as we mentioned in one of the previous lessons, the party has become more centralised, more organised, more moderate and more controlled, this naturally will help you win an election. And we don't need to go through all the reasons why that is the case. If you can't remember, look at the previous lesson. However, weaknesses. They do not have a good leader in Adamson. He is a moderate but politically unskilled. He doesn't understand mass politics. He's not very good at balancing different factions in the party, or that's less necessary. And he just doesn't understand how to fight in a modern campaign. There is still lingering fears in the party, lingering fears amongst the public about the idea that the Labour Party are a socialist menace. Remember that the Russian Revolution has happened in 1917, a year before, and there's people being laid up against the wall and shot while this election is going on. This is not necessarily a great advert for socialism. So there are many people, the idea that the Labour Party is reckless over socialists is particularly resonant amongst the middle classes. Now, interestingly, without getting into too much of a digression, the characterisation of the Labour Party throughout this period will change. As time goes on from about 1900, it will shift from this, they are radical socialists and they will bring revolution and death to us all, which becomes less credible as time goes on. And it will shift to a far more recognisable today argument that they are radical socialists, although they don't want revolution, they don't know what they're doing, and they'll spend all the money wrong. Arguably not too dissimilar about the narrative today, and that shift starts taking hold at this point here. There's fewer emphasis on the idea of socialism as a revolutionary capitalistic thing, and more about the idea of government spending and tax under the and government control over under a Labour government, as opposed to the idea of revolution, which is perhaps a good thing. As well as this, although they will take votes from the Liberals and hurt the Liberals by splitting the vote, simultaneously you can argue the Labour Party, because a lot of people will still vote for David Lloyd George and the Liberal parties, those are votes who are not going to Labour Party, who could go to Labour Party, and therefore split the vote. And therefore the real winner would be the Conservatives, i.e., although 20% of people might go to the Labour Party in the constituency, the other 20% stay Liberal, the Tories get 30, the Tories win. That's not great. So, essentially, the Labour Party goes in, probably argue with a more long-term advantage than the short-term advantage. It's also worth pointing out something which is not on here for some inexplicable reason, that actually rolling out the Representation of the People Act was much slower, and some historians cry foul. One just believes it's incompetence largely, but you never know. It's much slower to enfranchise working class men. Working class men, and many of them are still on the front line, do not get their papers and do not get the documents required in order to vote before the election. What the argument for is that after just a massive logistical effort, it requires individuals to go out of their way to chase it up, and that's far more likely to be the middle class women at home than the working class men on the front line. Some argue that it was made deliberately hard in order to discourage this in 1918. But the argument against that is, what do they expect to happen in the next election? But who knows? So that's another disadvantage. So one of the things you can point out why David Lloyd George wins necessarily is perhaps that the idea that there is no strong opposition, particularly on the left, that the parties, and he is the brand almost of happy vote for me liberalism. Asquith gets all the negative side, his party gets all the positive sides. The Labour Party, although they are growing and they are certainly a threat, still have deep problems, which mean they won't necessarily be the electoral takeover that many fear. Okay, and the Conservatives, you could argue, because of their deep loss of confidence, might naturally lead themselves to ally with David Lloyd George. And that's precisely what happens. At the end of the war, David Lloyd George wants to continue the coalition. Labour sees this as a cunning ploy in order to limit the momentum of their chance to vote, okay, and so therefore there has to be an election. Now, part of the reason the coalition government continues amongst certain Conservatives, or all Conservatives and certain Unionists, is in reality David Lloyd George had political and personal strengths which helped him gain the trust and support of the Tories. So personally, he had made many friends in the war cabinets, and many of the leading frontbenchers genuinely believed in David Lloyd George and supported him. In fact, part of their the frontbenchers' downfall later on will be they are too supportive of David Lloyd George when the backbenchers are not necessarily so. David Lloyd George, again, is someone who can bring a mass popular support, which the Conservatives are so deeply fearing after 1918, to the party, because Law is a Conservative and therefore not naturally sympathetic to working classes, but also not a massively great personality either. And so the argument is, if you take David Lloyd George, bring his popularity and his mass appeal to a Tory-controlled parliament, or to Tory-controlled government, then quite logically, you'll have the best of both worlds. You'll have control, but also you will not be destroyed by the rise in mass politics. Okay, so as well as that, David Lloyd George and Conservatives both fear the rise of the Labour Party, particularly after 1918, and so both support the idea of a joint party to avoid them splitting the vote. And it's also pointing out that David Lloyd George goes into this not necessarily loving the Tories. David Lloyd George loves power. And this is the only way he can really keep power. The Liberals are split and they won't take him back. The Labour Party won't take him because they're newly independent. And he's not going to win an election on his own. So therefore, this is pretty much his only choice for staying in power. Now, the election results are on there. You can look at them in your own time. But as we can see, although we see a large number of people voting for the non-coalition parties, we're having, for example, but roughly the same amount of Liberals voting for the coalition, people voting for Liberals and coalition Liberals, we will see that the Labour Party, Liberal parties, and to a less extent the non-coalition Conservative parties, tend to do less well in their seats that they are contesting. And this is because they are splitting the vote, essentially. Now, the beauty of the coalition coupon system, the coupon is, remember, the bit of paper which someone can wave around to say that, look, they are part of the coalition government, because otherwise how do you prove it in a world before mass media? The coupon system allows one to combine the vote. What this means is, say we got a Liberal constituency where the Tories would naturally lose, but now we have a coalition candidate standing, probably a Liberal. Then we've got a Liberal Party, a Labour Party, maybe other small parties, and the Conservatives. So say that Conservatives get 20%, so Conservatives get 10%, and everyone else gets 20% or something, 20% from there. The other parties get aggregated 20%. In reality, in theory, no one's won that, except for because they're in a coalition, the Conservatives are told to vote for the Liberal. So now what's happening is the half of people who will vote for David Lloyd George are added to by the Conservatives, balancing, so they are getting an inflated vote. Basically, they are avoiding splitting a vote. At the same time, the Liberals are losing votes because they are splitting with the coalition Liberals. Labour Party is splitting a vote with the Liberals and the coalition Liberals, and in some cases coalition Labour, and therefore getting fewer votes for the seats. Okay, so it's about essentially it's about splitting the vote, and this is one of the key factors you need to be able to explain the why they win. We've looked at the natural dispositions of the party, we've looked at David Lloyd George's personal role, and now we're looking at the idea of the electoral sort of running of the situation. And essentially, by combining votes, you are far more likely to win in a first past the vote election than if you split them a lot. And what happens is the opponents split and the coalitions combine. Now, I think this is one of the key roots of the success, and this is why, for example, coalition Liberals get far more elected because than the non-coalition Liberals, because the coalition Liberals, where they are running, all the Tories are also voting for them. And that massively helps in compared to Liberals who, where they are running, Labour Party are running against them, and coalition Liberals are running against them, and some Conservatives are running against them, and it's all a bit of a disaster, really. So, why did the coalition win the co-on election? So we've mentioned the role of David Lloyd George. He was the man who won the war, and more importantly, he's the man people believed when he promised a populist series of reforms. And don't underestimate the fact that David Lloyd George is voted into not by middle class people necessarily, but by as many working class people who trust him. People that they don't ultimately go to Labour, trust him to deliver. He's a man who's proven himself, he's a man who has won the war, a man who symbolises patriotism, and actually a good chunk of the working classes therefore vote for him. And so the role of David Lloyd George, number one, as a political figure, certainly helps. If you want to show off as well, we can point out actually as an organiser, behind the scenes backroom dealer, he has also put together the coalition government which helps win. So we can say actually David Lloyd George is instrumental in creating the coalition government, and having a coalition government means they don't split the vote, which equals they win. So you can actually say David Lloyd George helps in two ways, as a public figure and as a backroom political operator, because he allows the stuff to get done. So one of the key factors essentially is the populist power, populist regard that David Lloyd George is held into, and therefore how people believe that he will make the reforms, and the fact that he is behind the coalition government, etc., etc. He promised the change because of the war, social justice, homes for heroes, etc., 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 etc. We can say that women who gained the vote in 1918 managed, to some extent, balanced the rise in working class votes, which took the edge off the rise in Labour. Labour rises enough to still vote for the Liberals, but not enough to actually take power themselves, which is probably the best of both worlds if you're Conservative or National Liberal. As well as this, as we already mentioned, not all working class men have been registered by the election, therefore decreasing their vote. And again, big key thing to mention is the weaknesses of the Labour Party. They are not able to fight election that well, and there's still lingering distrust of socialism amongst them. Okay, they avoid splitting the vote, and Labour is pouring lead. Okay, so these are the key ideas. Hopefully these will still make sense because we mentioned them all already. But these are the key things you really need to point out. The role of David Lloyd George, the weaknesses of the opponents, the level of mandate, you can argue, the electoral, the changes to electoral system not being so bad, and avoiding splitting the vote. So what does this mean for the future? Essentially, and this will get into far more detail when we look at how successful, but more importantly, why does David Lloyd George fall? This arrangement is arguably the end of David Lloyd George. As we shall see in a bit, David Lloyd George has to prove to the Tories that he is worth having as a leader, because if you look at those votes, they do not need him. He has to keep on justifying his existence. And the way he justifies his being existence is he keeps the reason why they picked him to be their leader, i.e. he is the most popular leader by a country mile. He needs to keep that going, which means he needs to keep being popular. Now, the only way to keep being popular is making popular policies. But even if you make popular policies, you don't necessarily become popular. You need to make popular policies and be the face of the government that are making those policies. Okay, so you need to be in every photo op, you need to be in the front of the government, always making speeches, etc. The problem being at the front of the government means that when things go bad, he is also the face of that. And arguably what happens, therefore, is as more and more bad things happen, he more and more becomes blamed for it. As well as that, he realises that this system will never work in the long term, and he desperately tries to form the left wing of the Tories and right wing of the Liberals to make a new party. Ultimately, his Liberals do not like this. The Conservatives relatively support this because they think they can control it. The Liberals do not trust him, because remember, the Liberals who went with him are very often new Liberals and therefore more left-wing. Had he tried to do this with the Asquithian Gladstonians, it probably would have worked out of the sphere of socialism. David Lloyd George also has promised loads of reforms in the 1918 election to win it, and his failure to deliver them, as we shall see, will harm him, particularly his support amongst the working classes, which is the core of his popularity, arguably, and more importantly, the popularity that the Tories cannot get for themselves, and therefore David Lloyd George is important to bring. By losing that, he becomes less and less useful to them, and also becomes less and less a politically popular individual. As well as this, as part of the 1918 election, there will be a significant chunk of new MPs, particularly from conservative areas. These will be industrialists largely. We won't go into the details of why this happens, but the war is fundamental in transforming this. These are middle class, industrious based. These are people who have not all gone to Eton, not all are part of the same private members clubs, and therefore don't necessarily have don't have the same aristocratic code of honour and hierarchy, and therefore tend to rebel a lot more. And they tend to focus a little bit more on economic issues than they had before. So whereas when it used to be an aristocratic playground where everyone knew each other from boarding school and rugger, it was only so much disagreement there could be. But now we've got a bunch of backbenchers who come from a completely different group, class and ideology of their frontbenchers, who are still aristocrats, obviously, because they're frontbenchers, and that will cause divisions and splits, which in the end will cause more massive problems. The Labour Party has, as a result of beating the Liberals as a party of opposition, have proven itself as a party of opposition, and the split will only continue for the next election. MacDonald will come in a glorious show of sort of backstabbing as leader, using the defeat of this opportunity as a sign of his need for an irresistible rise, and pretty much even people who hate him agree that probably they need MacDonald because he is the only one who can really prove himself. And as well as this, because of the election, Sinn Féin win the bajillion, all the seats, not the Irish nationalists, showing the radicalism of Ireland, but as part of their policy of refusing to acknowledge Westminster, they refuse to attend Parliament, they set up their own government, and this very quickly leads, in a few more convoluted jumps, to the Anglo-Irish War. So, overall the message, and this is partly why it's a bit scrappy, this is partly why it's less of an important essay that they're less likely to ask. They can ask, obviously, so it's going to revise it. Is essentially what are the forces that shape it. We're talking about economic change, we're talking about David Lloyd George's popularity, we're talking about the failures of the Labour Party, the splits in the votes Liberal, and the relative smartness about keeping a combined vote. So essentially, that's it for 1918 election. We're going to move on to something far more meaty and far more likely to come up, which is the 1918 to 92, how successful David Lloyd George stuff. Until then, I will see you in the next video.